Wel, noswaith dda, neis gweld chi gyd. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod i'r darlith agored, Senedd San Steffan. It's really good to see you all tonight, and thank you for making it through Friday and still getting here. Fantastic. And in the terrible weather as well that we've been having, although we're not getting the worst of it at the moment. And I only talk about the weather so I can share with you, I've just told Colin this, so he's going to have to listen to it twice, my absolute favourite tweet that we got from a student around the very beginning of the storms at the start of January when things really were bad. And we got a tweet that said, at Aber Uni, 11 out of 10 for conduct in the face of the apocalypse. So I think we are now the only UK university to have ever got a score of 11 out of 10 for conduct in the face of the apocalypse, and I'll take that, that's all good. So it's a real pleasure to introduce this open lecture. It's organised as part of a programme of parliamentary outreach, and it's the first time, I believe, that Aberystwyth has had the pleasure of one of these events. So thanks to everybody who's made that possible in international politics in particular. And of course, thank you to our speaker for being willing to come and speak to us. Parliamentary outreach works with a whole range of organisations, not just with universities. And the aim is to improve public understanding of Parliament, help members of the public to get involved and engaged with legislative scrutiny, and also to demonstrate the importance and the relevance of Parliament to all parts of the UK. And if you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Outreach Programme, there's some flyers here and also outside where we'll have drinks afterwards. Or you can have a chat to Gary afterwards. Gary gives a wave. He's right at the back. He's allowed to be at the back because he's with the speaker. The rest of you should be further forward. We're really pleased that tonight's lecture is being given by Paul Evans. He's got a truly excellent job title. He is Principal Clerk of the Table Office in the House of Commons. I've never met one of those before. This is my first. And Paul is going to be exploring the origins and development and impact of parliamentary procedure, which is the set of rules that govern debate in the House of Commons. And Paul Evans joined the House of Commons in 1981 as a clerk, and he's held a number of senior roles, including the principal clerk of the select committees, and he's one of the UK's leading experts in parliamentary procedure and has co-authored several books, including Dodd's Handbook of House of Commons Procedure, which is now in its 8th edition. And even more importantly, I understand that he and Jenny Mathers, head of this department and our host for tonight, have been engaged in extensive email correspondence about whether dogs or cats make the best audience when you are trying out a speech. And it's good to know, I believe, that leaders in two of our more venerable institutions, the House of Commons and the Department of International Politics, still have a real close eye on the big questions of the day. I think that should reassure us all. I don't know if he's going to enlighten us about the outcome of the dogs versus cats discussion. Clearly, I have my own views on the matter. But I'm very much looking forward to hearing Paul's lecture, and I hope you'll join with me in welcoming him very warmly to Aberystwyth. Diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much all for coming along as well. I did check with a couple of my Welsh-speaking. I am a member of the diaspora, and I checked with some Welsh-speaking friends who I trusted whether I should essay some Welsh words of introduction, and I was warned against it. One of the advantages of working in the Palace of Westminster is you do a bit of shoulder rubbing with the great and the good, and 4 or 5 years ago I went to the St David's Day service in the Crypt Chapel, and all unheralded, the then Archbishop of Canterbury popped up to give the sermon, which he did alternately in Welsh and English. And I wasn't at all sure whether he was translating the Welsh as he was, the English into Welsh or vice versa, or whether he was continuing the argument in each language, because I was completely baffled whether it was in English or Welsh, I have to say. So I hope that's not going to be the effect tonight, though I'm going to be a bit theological. And I will get on to dogs and cats, because I'm going to set out quite a lot of binary oppositions about who are the best. We all know what the answer to dogs and cats are, but we'll save that up for the end. So As the Vice-Chancellor explained, my job is as a clerk in the House of Commons. The clerks have a long history, and last year marked the 650th anniversary of the appointment of Robert de Melton, the first recorded under-clerk of the Parliaments, an office which later became known as the Clerk of the House of Commons. And there are now about 100 who might be called clerks working in the House, supporting the work of its two chambers and its many legislative and select committees. And the clerks are a bit like the civil service of the House, a mix of administrators, facilitators, political advice givers, drafters, and so on. But they are also, with particular relevance to this lecture, the guardians of House of Commons procedure. And I'm going to talk rather a lot about clerks this evening, I'm afraid, and I'm going to concentrate almost exclusively on the House of Commons to the neglect of the other place. At the head of our small profession, the Clerk of the House is the principal procedural advisor to the Speaker, and the House more widely. He, and so far there has not been a she, is the guardian of what is sometimes known as the lex parliamentaria, the law of Parliament. Now, the law of Parliament embraces quite a lot of other things apart from procedure, but procedure is a large part of it and is my subject this evening. And what is procedure? Well, as the Vice-Chancellor helpfully explained at the beginning, it is essentially the rules that govern how and what the House debates, and how it reconciles disagreements, and how it reaches decisions. Perhaps the first really notable clerk of the House of Commons was John Hatsell. He held that office for 52 years, till his death in 1820, though for the last 24 years or so he didn't actually turn up for work, but paid someone else to do it for him. Even in the morally relaxed atmosphere of the 18th century House, this raised eyebrows. He was probably also the highest paid holder of the office in history. His share of the income from fees for taking private bills through the House was equivalent to something like £1 million in today's money. Though, of course, out of that he had to pay for quite a lot of other people to do the more tiresome aspects of his duties, like turning up for work. This was also noticed, and his successors have been paid a salary rather than reaping the profits of the House's legislative activity on behalf of enclosers, canal cutters, railway undertakers, corporations, and their like. But the source of Hatsell's wealth is a useful reminder that public legislation, making the general law that applies to all citizens or subjects, was once a relatively minor part of the House's work. And although public and general legislations existed in some form almost as long as Parliament, it only really began to build up in the 19th century and took over as the core business of the House only in the 20th. And I'm going to look at the procedural consequences of that change. However, to go back to Hatsell, it is for something other than his wealth or his assiduous attention to his work-life balance that he is now remembered. He was the first great systematiser of parliamentary procedure in his Precedents of Proceedings in the House of Commons with Observations, published between 1776 and 1796. And while assembling this great work, Hatsell observed that it is more material that there should be a rule to go by than what the rule is, in order that there may be uniformity of proceeding in the business of the House, not subject to the momentary caprice of the Speaker or the captious disputes of any members. It is not so material that the rules should be established on the foundation of sound reason and argument, as it is that order, decency, and regularity should be preserved in a large, numerous, and consequently sometimes tumultuous assembly. So this evening, I'm going to explore where parliamentary procedure came from, how it developed, and perhaps why, and I hope to give a little time to some philosophical speculation about whether the rules that embody it now are fit for purpose. There are many different views of procedure, however, and I would not claim that Hatsell's systematising instincts have been shared by all his successors. Speaker Denison recalled that Hatsell's immediate successor, old Mr. Lay, John Lay, Clerk of the House from 1820 to 1850, used to ask, what does it signify about precedents? The House can do what it likes. Who can stop it? And I wouldn't wholly disagree with old Mr. Lay. My starting point in any procedural discussion is that the House can do what it likes by unanimous consent. But it is the House, not its individual members, that can do anything it wants. The rules to go by come into play when there are disagreements to be resolved between the components of the House or with the other parts of Parliament, the Crown and the Lords. However, Until relatively recently, precedent was the prevailing, though never exclusive, basis of the law of Parliament, as it was of England and Wales law more generally. Hatsell believed that it was only by strict adherence to precedent, the forms and rules of proceedings, that the weaker party can be protected from those irregularities and abuses which these forms were intended to check, and which the wantonness of power is but too often apt to suggest to large and successful majorities. Curiously, John Hatsell's work survives most visibly in the modern world in the form of Thomas Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Procedure, which continues to hold some sway in the US Congress as a final authority on procedure. In the opening pages of the manual, Jefferson quotes Hatsell, quoting Speaker Onslow, Speaker from 1728 to 1761, to the effect that nothing tended to throw more power into the hands of the administration and those who acted with the majority of the House of Commons than a neglect of or departure from the rules of proceedings. That belief, that the purpose of procedure is principally to protect the minority, is one that we shall see is not necessarily the dominant view in the centuries that followed. I will explore further the tensions between this minoritarian view and the emergence of a more majoritarian analysis. Anyway, to return to Hatsell's successors, more clerks. Thomas Erskine May is certainly the clerk of the House of Commons most honoured by posterity. He may have owed his appointment in 1831, at the tender age of 16, as Assistant Librarian of the House of Commons to his status as the illegitimate son of the first Baron Erskine, a big beast among the Whigs. At the very least, we can say that young Thomas certainly seems to have made very little effort to dispel this version of his antecedents. It was while serving in this relatively humble role that he compiled his treatise on the law, privileges, proceedings and usage of Parliament, the first edition of which was published in 1844, when May was still only 29. He became Clerk of the House in 1871, and his treatise went through 8 further editions in his lifetime. It is now in its 24th. Its editorship is considered a perquisite of the holder of the office of Clerk of the House of Commons, but none of Erskine May's 19 successors has had the presumption to give the book the title of their own name. The treatise almost entirely superseded Hatsell's precedents, which was largely forgotten other than in Washington, and its curious immortality in the hands of May's successors has entrenched its position so deeply that it cannot now be referred to in the media, or almost anywhere else, except where it is always known as May or Erskine May, without the accompanying phrase, the Bible of Parliamentary Procedure. It was once quite regularly brandished on the floor of the House at moments of controversy, though claims of this sign of activity are much rarer nowadays. Though broadly working within the same conceptual framework, Hatsell and May in some ways represent 2 contrasting approaches to procedure, the strands of which I will be trying to draw out in this lecture. It would be easy to read Hatsell's precedents. Actually, it wouldn't be at all easy to read Hatsell's precedents, and come away with little or no idea how Parliament actually worked or why. In the introduction to his first volume, Hatsell warns that its readers must not suppose that the observations upon the several cases are made with a view to declaring what the law of privilege is. May, in contrast, is more a man of derived principles and deduced general rules. He preferring brief statements of the general results of precedents to a lengthened enumeration of the precedents themselves. May was, after all, a liberal and believed that organisation is not less essential in a Senate than in a factory. May was a moderniser then, but he was a cautious and tactical one, not above using precedent when it suited his modernising purposes. When seeking to justify the closure procedure, of which we will hear more later, he reported in his diary with what I believe was some sarcasm that he had found what convinces the House of Commons more readily than any argument. I have found a precedent. So May was the brains behind many of the profound procedural changes in the Commons which took place following the Second Reform Act. Before we look at those changes, it may be worth pausing to ask what might be presumed to be the principal features of the old procedure from which the Victorians, with Erskine May's help, made a decisive break. Well, all members had equal rights to bring forward business for debate. There was no priority for government business, and indeed in the early periods, there was no identifiable government. There were no restrictions on the length of speeches or on the duration of a debate. There was a rule that speeches had to be relevant, though in my own experience of advising the chair on scope of debate, I think it's quite unlikely that that rule was well applied. There were no clear limits on the hours of sitting in the House. It would rise when there was no more business to be done, and any member had the right to move the adjournment of a debate or of the House. It would resume when it chose to, or in some periods when the King chose for it to. All business was regulated by ad hoc motions rather than by any standing orders, which could be consulted in advance and on which one might reasonably hope to predict the order and duration of the day's business. It required 18, or according to some authorities 17, debatable and votable motions just to get through the procedural stages of a bill, before you even started on the content. It must have been a delightful, if exasperating, kind of anarchy. But as another clerk has wisely observed, it is doubtful whether this procedurally idyllic Garden of Eden ever fully existed. And I would add, we should be duly sceptical as to whether this mythical procedural Eden would really have been all that paradisical to sit in. So it probably did need a systematizer of May's calibre who was prepared to deduce general principles from particular examples, rather than approach each procedural dilemma as a separate problem for which some close analogy in the past needed to be sought and from which an answer might be divined. But the contemporary seeker after guidance, who has recourse to the 24th edition of Erskine May, might be disappointed if they hoped for a clear and unambiguous statement of the rules by which the House conducts itself. The treatise as it now stands is the product of many hands and many revisions and many different views of parliamentary procedure, despite intermittent heroic attempts to tidy it up. Often it plumbs unfathomable depths of ambiguity, something which does help the clerks retain their professional mystique, I suppose. To that extent, it is quite like the Bible, and the clerks have a certain priestly quality to their role in interpreting the law of procedure. And, as with the Bible, there are regular attempts to usurp its position as the sole repository of revealed truth. Its canonical status is actually quite curious, I think, for a work which, in the end, represents the current editor's view of the collective wisdom of centuries. I hope by now you have noticed that I'm trying to set up an antithesis, cats and dogs, etc., between what might be termed the common law or organic model of parliamentary procedure and the rationalist or Roman law model. Now, the poet and philosopher Samuel Taylor Coleridge claimed that everyone is born either a Platonist or an Aristotelian. The librettist W.S. Gilbert argued, on the other hand, that every boy and every girl is born either a little liberal or else a little conservative. You might find it easier to agree with Gilbert than with Coleridge, so long as you accepted that political parties are never as hegemonic as they hoped to be, and that even in the time of Iolanthe, there were conservative liberals and liberal conservatives. But for this evening's purposes, I am going to pretend that you are forced to choose. One explanatory model from where parliamentary procedure came from and what its purpose is. So this evening I am going to adopt Coleridge's implausible binary model, with touches of Gilbert and Sullivan when required, as a procedural device for carrying my argument. For the little Platonist conservative, the law of Parliament is the product of the laws of nature and grows out of the natural order of things. It reflects the human striving to reflect, however mistily, the perfect mode of human debate. For the little Aristotelian liberal, it is a mechanism designed by the enlightened to deliver enlightenment to the unenlightened. For the Platonist, the Parliament we see is a mere shadow of the perfect Parliament, which we are striving always to uncover, using procedure where necessary. But the perfect Parliament, of which we only catch glimpses, is as eternal and unchanging as human nature. For the Aristotelian, Parliament is the more or less scientific product of the human endeavour to create politics, and procedure must be designed and, where necessary, redesigned to deliver what politics demands. So what are the tangible procedural outcomes of these opposing philosophies? W.H. Greenleaf, in his book on the British political tradition, gave his own particular version of the two opposing views of procedure I am trying to present this evening as follows. The libertarian, Platonist in my terms, wishing as he does to restrict the field of government action, will necessarily stress the need to revivify parliamentary powers of inquisition and control, and to limit the flow of statute making. On the other hand, the collectivist, Aristotelian in my terms, will tend to see Parliament as a legislative machine, a means of processing and legitimising the ever more numerous proposals of the executive for the achievement of the general good. And in the last resort, he will allow no procedural device or scrutiny to stand in the way. I might say that Aristotelians privileged decision over dissent, the Platonists the individual veto over the collective will. Or alternatively, that the Platonists see the purpose of Parliament as stopping the government doing things to us, and the Aristotelians see its purpose as being to enable the government to do things for us. The distribution of Platonists and Aristotelians across the political spectrum from right to left is not quite as even, in my experience, as Greenleaf suggests. Platonists may oppose procedural reform as a departure from the natural order which weakens Parliament. Aristotelians may oppose it because it is a concession to human frailty which makes government weak. And either of these outcomes may be desired from right or left. Now, in the USA, there are a number of popular manuals which seek to apply what is generically called parliamentary procedure to the meetings of associations, clubs, citizens groups, and so forth, essentially any self-governing voluntary organisation. And one of these is Alice Sturgis's The Standard Manual of Parliamentary Procedure, which argues, with admirable clarity and assertiveness, the cheerfully Aristotelian view that parliamentary law is the procedural safeguard that protects the individual and the group in the exercise of their rights of free speech, free assembly, and the freedom to unite in organisations for the achievement of common aims. These rights are meaningless, and the timeless freedoms they define can be lost if parliamentary procedure is not observed. The philosophy of parliamentary law is constructive, to make it easier for people to work together effectively and to help organisations and members accomplish their purposes. But for the conservative Platonist, Parliament is not an organisation established to deliver particular ends in a constructive manner. For the Platonist, Parliament is a kind of contest by champion, or a theatre in which to play out and resolve the tensions in society. But that doesn't mean they issue all rules. For us to follow this contest, it still needs to be conducted according to a set of conventional expectations. Another popular US handbook is George Demeter's Manual of Parliamentary Law and Procedure, which boldly claims, to the irritation I feel sure of any anarchists present this evening, that without rules there would be injustice and confusion. Hence, it is as necessary to follow the rules of parliamentary procedure as it is to follow the rules of a ball game or a card game. But if those rules are overwrought, archaic, and impenetrable, the audience will be baffled, bored, or angry, or more probably all three in succession, or even simultaneously, as I have been when forced to watch, or even worse, participate in, American football. Indeed, I think American football has many of the worst characteristics of Parliament. Short flurries of incomprehensible activity interspersed by long intervals when nothing at all seems to be happening. So, procedural reform can be intended to clarify, lay bare, or release the underlying process of debate from the incrustations of time or the impositions of one or other eccentric view of precedent. Or it might be undertaken with a view to making procedure more efficient in delivering outcomes. Our two philosophical camps might be able to agree that Parliament is about the struggle of ideas, and that disagreement is its input, and, particularly for the Aristotelian, reconciliation is supposed to be its main output. But one of the problems with this rather abstract description, especially for the Platonists, is that it ignores the fact that the House of Commons is made up of 650 MPs, each with a different take on what the answers to all our problems are, and each, typically, with an unusually strong sense of their own authority, by dint of winning a seat at a democratic election. Although political parties are there to try and make sense of this bubbling cauldron of different views, there is a wide feeling abroad that parties may have lost much of their explanatory force for the nation. And anyway, there is often a wide difference of opinion to be found between the front benches of any party and its back benches. The shadow leader of the House, Angela Eagle, recently estimated publicly that no MP agrees with more than 40% of what is in their party's manifesto. For the Platonist, the purpose of procedure is to give free expression to that range of opinion. For the Aristotelian, its purpose is to orchestrate or harness a majority of those 650 individual voices to the delivery of a manifesto. It is often claimed that the Westminster model, with its fuzzy boundaries between the executive and legislature and its lack of compliance with the rules of separation of powers, is more effective at getting things done and has been able to evolve procedures which deliver this goal more efficiently than constitutionally bound and court-tied legislatures. I referred earlier to the US Congress and the influence of Hatsell on its procedures. The House of Representatives, under the constitutional separation of powers between President and Congress, performs its role today in a way which would probably be much more recognisable to the 17th century House of Commons than the current House of Commons is. Certainly, it generally seems more about thwarting than enabling government. Many British MPs, from both sides of the House, cast envious eyes on the House of Representatives, believing it to be a purer kind of legislature than our muddled arrangements. That envy, however, may be reciprocated. During the recent fiscal cliff crisis, I heard one American commentator on the Today programme assert that the US political system had too many checks and not enough balances. So where did the Westminster model come from? There is a familiar enough story of parliamentary evolution in Britain which is true enough to be usable. In this narrative, the unformed Parliament emerges in ways which we still haven't quite managed to pin down, out of the advisers that the King gathered around him, and through in which he enforced his will on his subjects, through a more or less subtle mixture of playing on their self-interest and the exercise of coercive power. In particular, Parliament became a necessary sanction for the raising of taxes, mostly to finance wars, a subject I will return to. The power of initiative lay with the Crown, the power of restraint with the Parliament. In 1947, in his Thoughts on the Constitution, Leo Amery asserted that the main task of Parliament is still what it was when first summoned, not to legislate or govern, but to secure full discussion and ventilation of all matters. Another Clerk, who wrote extensively of parliamentary reform, and whom I would probably have to put in my Aristotelian camp, the late Michael Ryle, argued in his standard work Parliament that it is as a debating forum, not as a governing body, that Parliament should be assessed. But I doubt if this is the yardstick by which Parliament is most often judged, certainly by the media, and it is difficult to reconcile this relatively modest version of Parliament's mission with its claims to be the only begetter of the nation's laws. We are told often enough that in the UK, Parliament, or to put it technically, the Queen in Parliament, is sovereign. And I think the best summation of this is Erskine May's from 1844. He said, "The legislative authority of Parliament extends over the United Kingdom and all its colonies and foreign possessions, and there are no other limits to its power of making laws for the whole empire than those which are incident to all sovereign authority, the willingness of the people to obey or their power to resist. Unlike the legislatures of many countries, it is bound by no fundamental charter or constitution." Now, the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty has probably been picked over by constitutional jurists and political scientists in as much detail as the doctrine of the Holy Trinity has been picked over by theologians, and to a similar degree of consensus. But what I most like about May's pithy summary above is that it reminds us of the tension between the sovereignty of Parliament and the sovereignty of the people. Securing popular assent in a democracy to the exercise of authority is surely one of the key purposes of a Parliament. And one of the key points of procedure is to make sovereign decisions about what the subjects of the sovereign can and cannot do seem to arise from fair play. One simplistic way of looking at the claim of sovereignty is that Parliament has evolved to take the place of the autocratic king and holds collectively the same powers as he once did. And one of the great advantages of being an autocrat is, of course, that you don't have to argue with yourself. You merely have to subdue others to your will. Parliament, having subdued and subsumed the autocrat, has to find a way of reaching what can plausibly be presented as a single decision on any matter, arrived at through due process which it sets down for arguing with itself. And that is another of the purposes of procedure. And the procedures for achieving this matter more where a parliament is sovereign than they do where we can subcontract to the courts the task of judging its processes and outcomes against some fundamental law or constitution. Many of the fundamental principles of parliamentary law grew out of the tensions between the Crown and people that had in the 17th century erupted in the civil wars and ended in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where the subordination of the monarchy to Parliament was finally and enduringly established. But at the turn of the 20th century, another clerk of the House of Commons, Courtney Ilbert, characterised the period after the century of revolutions in the following rather derogatory terms, which include, you may notice, a dig at the whole profession of clerks. He said, "The principles evolved in creative and revolutionary periods were laboriously reduced to form, and in the process life and growth were often arrested and tendencies were ossified into dogmas. Parliamentary procedure became a mystery, unintelligible except to the initiated, and the officials who formulated the rules were not anxious that their knowledge should be too widely shared." I think that's something we can all agree with. So Ilbert, at least, was doubtful whether procedure in Hatsell's era served either the purpose of winning hearts and minds or display the characteristics of due process. For the Aristotelian Ilbert, who was incidentally the author of the 1910 Parliament Act, Hatsell and company had failed even as Platonists. They had lost sight of the natural order of things in their entrancement with the detail of the law. So we can dismiss the 18th century. I will come back to the 20th century shortly, but first we should perhaps have a quick look at the 19th. If the 17th century was about subduing the king to Parliament, the 19th was about subduing Parliament to the people. The century was dominated by franchise reform and the increasing democratisation of the Commons. It was also the period in which what is still recognisably the foundations of the modern state were laid down by statutes regulating employment, housing, public health, establishing something approaching university education, reforming or establishing universities, and creating local authorities with extensive powers of their own, amongst many other social and economic reforms. And from the middle of the century, or certainly after the Second Reform Act, we begin to see the emergence of the political parties as national organisations, and all these developments were to have a transforming effect on Parliament and the way it organised itself. Something else happened at the start of the 19th century, which was to have a profound impact on procedural reform towards its close, and that was the Act of Union with Ireland of 1800. 80 years later, the obstructionist tactics employed by the Irish nationalists seeking to dissolve the Union had brought the House of Commons almost to a standstill and helped precipitate a sea change in the balance between the powers of the majority and the minorities. The tactics of the obstructionists, combined with the pressure to legislate, provoked two procedural innovations which some still regard as the symbols of the House's capitulation to the executive majoritarian dominance. The first was the closure. It is a device for forcing the House to a decision on any single question if a majority wished to curtail further debate. It was invented, rather on the hoof, by Mr. Speaker Brand, who borrowed it from France. The fact that he got away with it, indeed was admired, is evidence of the transformation of the Speaker, by this time, 1880s, from the King's narc or the government's placeman to the independent figure he still is today. The independence of the presiding officer is an important element of the House of Commons procedures and the way we do things, and is another area in which we have left the House of Representatives in Washington languishing several hundred years behind us. That independence is supported by an elaborate theology of impartiality, which is in itself part of the treasure house of precedent, and which helps protect the House from any momentary caprice of the Speaker, which John Hatsell warned us against earlier. So the third great source of the rules of procedure, alongside precedent, and the standing orders, which I'll come to in a minute, are rulings from the chair, the reinterpretation of our rules, customs and conventions by the Speaker, which helps marry tradition to modern circumstances and to temper procedural propriety with an appreciation of that mysterious miasma, the mood of the House. Speaker Brand's invention of the closure is just the most dramatic historical example of this being done. The second procedural innovation of the 1880s was the guillotine, an efficient but brutal piece of procedural machinery for cutting lots of debates off in short order, enabling government bills to get onto the statute book. With these and many other changes, by the beginning of the First World War, the procedure of the House of Commons were built around sustaining the party that could secure a majority in power in order to deliver a manifesto programme of reform, or reaction to reform. As well as the closure and the guillotine, the change can be traced in the wider growth of the standing orders, which increasingly took over from precedent and custom the central role in governing the procedures of the House. And it was not just the statist parties of the left that promoted this agenda. The Balfour reforms of 1902 were the major annexation of the time of the House by the government. By 1908, there were 96 standing orders, all but 5 of which had been made after 1832. In 1906, Joseph Redlich, an Austrian academic, liberal, politician and intellectual, published, in German, his great work of observational anthropology on the parliamentary procedures of Westminster. He was on a mission to educate the Continentals in the ways of democracy. He concluded that parliamentary procedure was no ordered scheme planned by one powerful mind, and that the historic order of business of the House of Commons was never affected, either as a whole or in its separate parts, by juristic speculation or political theory. I hope you will note that in this faculty. But that its origins and growth, the cautious and often imperceptible transformations which it underwent, sprang from practical wants, expressed the actual facts of political power and historical constitutional relations. And I think that's a very fine analysis, with some touches of Marx and a rather Platonist view in some ways. But in my crude scheme of oppositions, I must put Redlich firmly in the camp of the Aristotelians, who saw the purpose of parliaments as to enable the creation of a modern and efficient state, privileging not opposition, or even that modern idea, scrutiny, but effective governance. Indeed, he described his purpose in researching and writing his book as being to answer the question of how a parliament was to discharge the function of enabling the state to perform its regular work. Another later 20th century, more radical expression of this philosophy of procedural reform was perfectly encapsulated by a delegate to the Labour Party conference in 1933, who declared that parliamentary procedure was devised to protect property from the king. It is being used now to protect property from the people, and socialism involves the transference of property and the abolition of the powers of property. We have got, therefore, to be prepared to recast the whole form of procedure by democratic government in order to carry through our programme. And indeed, over the following 80 years, pretty much the whole form of parliamentary procedure has been recast. Though whether the result has been socialism, I will leave others to judge. I noted earlier that in 1832 there were 5 standing orders, and that by 1908, 96. Today there are a shade over 200. That increasing codification of rules to overturn or set aside precedents based on what had once been a self-governing rather than government-led assembly has largely been shaped by the drive to secure government business. The major waves of procedural reform have come from radical governments in a hurry to drive through major social reform, the Liberal government of 1905, the Labour governments of 45 and 97, but Conservative governments have played their part and generally played along with reform. By 2010, all the time of the House, at least technically, was at the disposal of the government, with the exception of 20 opposition days and 13 Fridays reserved for private members' bills. A member of the Cabinet, the Leader of the House, had the final say on its agenda. Writing in 1906, my Austrian Aristotelian, Joseph Redlich, let slip another rather wistful and Platonist observation. He mused, however complete the reforms of the 19th century may have been, the procedure of the House of Commons remains a thoroughly English piece of construction. It has not lost the ancient Gothic style. Far from it. The rebuilding which has taken place has left the historic foundations untouched, wherever they are capable of supporting the superstructure. It has left many a wing of the rambling fabric with scrolls and ornaments unmutilated. If we are to feel at home in the new mansion, we must learn all about the plans of the old. but I think it is perhaps more debatable whether the reforms of the 20th century have left much of those historic foundations visible. And I want to take a couple of examples. First, financial procedure. The control of supply, that is, deciding how much money the government can raise through taxes and then deciding what it can be spent on, which is, according to constitutional theory, the fundamental reason for the existence of the House of Commons. And yet we have moved a long way from the prolonged proceedings of the Committee of Supply and Ways and Means under the old procedure. In 1900, the process of agreeing supply, already considerably simplified, took about a third of the time available to the House. Balfour's reforms of 1902 reduced this to 20-odd days. Over the following half-century, the connection between the debates held on these days and the details of public finance became increasingly tenuous. In the 1960s, the ancient committees were abolished, and in 1982, the House abandoned all pretense of a connection between the debates chosen by the opposition and the control of national finance and created the modern opposition days. What we are left with are 3 estimates days each session, when, after a debate on a select committee or report or two, only loosely connected with national finances, if at all, the House nods through the 700 billion or so of public money. Control of supply has, on the floor of the House, been reduced for the most part to a series of undebatable decisions. On one of these estimates days, the House will also nod through defence votes A. This is the residue of that other great claim of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that the Crown shall not maintain a standing army in times of peace without the consent of Parliament. But I doubt whether 6 MPs out of 650 are even aware of the existence of defence votes A. But these reforms were a rational solution to the problem of voting supply and a pragmatic response to where the interests of MPs seemed to lie. Though it took some time to complete the reforms process, the scrutiny of expenditure has now been delegated in practice to the select committees of the House, and I think most commentators would agree that they do it much better, if unevenly, than the plenary chamber, sitting as the Committee of Supply, ever did. But the result appears to have made the control of supply something to which no backbencher or even opposition party appears to feel it has any great stake in, at least as far as debating it on the floor of the House goes. It is very difficult to trace those foundations of a profoundly important constitutional principle in modern procedure. My second example is legislative procedure. I have already mentioned the guillotine and touched on the use of committees. At the beginning of this century, a more comprehensive and rational solution was introduced, programming of legislation, which essentially involves guillotining every stage of a bill's progress after second reading according to a timetable set from the outset. This may be the Aristotelian reform that has had the most profound effect on the chamber in a century, and it is still the subject of controversy, and many believe that the quality of the House of Commons scrutiny of legislation in the era of programming is the strongest argument for having a House of Lords. My third example is a small but symbolic one: time limits on speeches. Though the House proceeded gingerly with this notion to begin with, nowadays probably more speeches from the backbenchers are time limited than not. Whether the bargain struck these days, a lot of 4 to 6 minute speeches and wider participation, is better than fewer, lengthy and often dull speeches, but with time occasionally to develop a complex argument other than from the front benches, is a matter for debate. However, as I move towards my conclusion, you'll be relieved to hear, I want to look very briefly at some procedural developments which seem to go against the general direction of travel I've been describing. In a concatenation of circumstances which began with the expenses debacle and ended with the coalition government, in 2010 the House took the first step in a century and a half to reverse the drift of control of the agenda to the government. About a fifth to a quarter of the time available for debate was handed over to backbenchers, and a committee was elected to distribute the time, for which it has adopted a sort of Dragon's Den model. A startling and surprising feature of this reform was that there were very few restrictions placed on the kind of motions that could be debated at these times. In theory, it is possible for the House's backbenchers, should they be able to assemble a cross-party majority, to amend its standing orders to reduce further the government's grip, or at least to do something in the face of government opposition. Previously, all the government needed to do was to fail to find time for any inconvenient business. In practice, with few notable exceptions, for example, the debate on the EU referendum, the committee has been quite conservative in its approach, and the Westminster Spring, which the most enthusiastic champions of reform had hoped for, has not quite happened. Nonetheless, the simple expedient of asking backbenchers what they want to debate has certainly had a modestly revivifying effect on the Chamber, and seems to have engaged the attention of the electorate more effectively, to judge by viewing figures on BBC Parliament. The second is of my examples of the drift and the going against the tide, is the parallel chamber of the House, known misleadingly as Westminster Hall, a concept which procedural traditionalists would have said was inconceivable. But the House, around about 2000, granted itself the gift of bilocation, a gift which, so far as I know, had previously been granted only to St Thomas Aquinas. As originally conceived, Westminster Hall was a vehicle for debating a whole range of potential matters, probably of a largely non-party nature, before even referring them back to the plenary for decision. In practice, it has never been used for this, and although scorned by a significant part of the House as the epitome of a talking shop, in Westminster Hall for 3 days a week, individual backbenchers, groups of backbenchers and select committees operating in a discursive and non-decision-oriented procedure raise points of concern ranging from the most local to the most wide and international. And they seem to enjoy the opportunity. It has a much less formal and adversarial atmosphere than the main chamber. The third and most famous of these procedural innovations, against the tide, is of course the departmental select committee system, now approaching its 35th birthday. And I have to confess I can't quite decide whether it was an Aristotelian or a Platonist reform. I think it was probably a Platonist reform promoted by Aristotelians. But although select committees are as old as the House itself, pretty much, and have proved to be a very flexible instrument, the establishment of the departmental select committee system and its offshoots, which over the last 30-odd years has grown massively in resources, professionalism and public esteem, has been the most profound change in Parliament of the last century. The notion of scrutiny, a rather Platonist idea of checking government excess, has become a common term in the popular lexicon. The centre of gravity of the House of Commons has certainly shifted dramatically from the chamber to the committees. And strikingly, for the purposes of my thesis, select committees are largely procedure-free zones. They deliberate rather than debate, and they do it in private. In public, they converse, more or less politely and constructively, with the unelected in all shapes and sizes, not only the mighty, but sometimes also the humble and the meek. And the public seem to like this style of politics, which tends to the constructive and consensual and the rather human, though with all the flaws that human implies. Now, while I was in the throes of composing this lecture, I came across a review of the parliamentary sketches of the late Simon Hoggart, which referred to the wide gap between human procedure and parliamentary procedure. And I concluded, it made me ask myself, what are the essentials of parliamentary procedure? And I concluded that perhaps the most particular mark of British parliamentary procedure and its derivatives is that at any one time there is only one proposition before the House, though I could spend another hour qualifying that statement. The minutes of our proceedings do not record the obiter dicta and inconsequential ramblings of the participants in debate. We have Hatsell to do that for us. They record boldly just the propositions put forward, those rejected, and the one finally arrived at. And this is not, I have to admit, anything like human procedure. The thrust of procedural science over the last century and a half has most often been an effort to reduce the work of the House to a minimum number of propositions to which assent is given or from which it is withheld. It privileges clarity and tries to reduce uncertainties. It eschews mysteries and doubts and ambiguities. It is very different from life as most of us live it. So to return to my title, do we need a rule to go by? We do. Recognise ways of doing things, recognise rights for dissenting voices to be heard, and ways of reconciling differences not just within the House, but also between the House and others, are essential. Is it material, what the rule is? Yes, it is. Because although we shape the rules then shape us. And what the rules are determine to a large degree what the purpose of Parliament appears to be. Does it matter whether we understand the rules? It does. And unless the owners of Parliament, the voters, have a reasonable chance of grasping what it is about, then it will fail to engage their interest and emotions and earn their confidence. So, what you believe the point of parliamentary procedure is depends on what you think the purpose of Parliament is. You don't have to be exclusively an Aristotelian or a Platonist or a cat or a dog. Quite a lot of the time, we are trying to keep a foot in both camps. And as James Maxton, definitely a Platonist and Aristotelian on parliamentary procedure, once wisely observed, if you can't ride two horses at the same time, you shouldn't be in the circus. Professionally, I am required to retain a posture of uncertainty about whether I am a born Platonist who has been convinced by the arguments of the Aristotelians, or a born Aristotelian who has recognised the force of the objections of the Platonists. But I think there may be a risk if Aristotelian, sovereign, scientific, law-making aspect of parliamentary procedure becomes entirely separated from the discursive, human, obstreperous, and rather inefficient Platonist part of parliamentary procedure. If Parliament as a human talking shop becomes too distinct from Parliament as a legislative sausage machine, and the decision-making aspects of procedure too separate from the debating elements, then the Aristotelians in the electorate will see the Platonist aspects of Parliament as irrelevant, and the Platonist voters will view the Aristotelian aspects as illegitimate. And if, at some point of existential crisis, the tension pulled them entirely apart, then the power of procedure to demonstrate fair play and win the assent of the people to the exercise of sovereign power could be severely weakened. It would be an odd result if the only thing that stood between the House of Commons and the withdrawal of the people's consent was the House of Lords. The science of procedure is to ensure that that doesn't happen. Thank you.